Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome to another episode of Lost in Adaptation. Today we'll be comparing the film Alice in Wonderland to the progenitor story, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.
A very merry birthday to me, to me.
Oh, you?
A very merry birthday to you.
Who, me?
Yes, you.
Oh, me?
Let's all congratulate us with another cup of tea.
Published in 1865 under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll, real name Charles Dodson, the world and the characters he created remained insanely influential over the following century and a half. Since the start of the 20th century, there have been multiple attempts to adapt the book into a successful movie. For those of you disappointed that this isn't being done as a Demoscus, fear not, that will happen too. I just felt this film deserves its own episode first, as it is by far the most iconic of all the adaptations. I am, of course, referring to the animated Walt Disney production from 1951. After some thought, I've decided to introduce a new policy for comparing films based off short stories. As adding stuff in is inevitable, it's not fair to be too judgmental about it, especially if the things they're adding in are in keeping with the original tone of the book. The flip side of this is I'm going to be a lot less forgiving of them leaving stuff out. Only 12 chapters and you still couldn't include everything? Bitch, please. But first, my thoughts on the book and the film as individuals. I don't actually have that much to say here, as is often the case with the things that I liked as opposed to the things that annoyed me. The book's a pretty relaxing read, not following the traditional structure of any normal narrative, but having an almost hypnotic poetry to the way it's written. I'd recommend it to all ages. It's only 12 short chapters, so it'll probably only take you an afternoon to get through it all unless you really pace yourself. If stories having a point to them is important to you, you might find it a bit frustrating, but all in all, I'd say it really doesn't surprise me that this book achieved immortality so quickly. The film? Drug references! Drug references everywhere in a kids movie! Yeah, other people have talked that point to death. Aside from that, it's a well-animated Disney classic. Personally, I didn't care for the musical numbers, but then I never do, so I won't hold that against it. If you weren't shown this film as a kid, you really missed out, but you'll probably still have fun with it if you watch it now. Okay, let's compare these bad boys. Disney nailed most of the storyline. A bored child sees a rabbit dressed in human clothing and proclaiming that he's running behind schedule disappear into a rabbit hole. She follows and falls into a world where every single one of the residents is batshit insane and nothing seems to work the way it's supposed to. The vertically furnished rabbit hole is in the book, although there it's not confirmed if it's just really deep or if Alice is falling in slow motion. Considering the lack of fatality in her landing, it's probably safe to assume the latter. The film included some nice snippets of original book dialogue in the form of Alice's little muses to herself. For example, wondering if she was falling through the entire planet and about to meet people who stand on their head, and her insistence on checking the magic shrinking potion for poison markings before drinking it on the grounds that might disagree with her. The unusual mix of flavouring in said potion was also a book original. Curiouser and curiouser is also a direct quote from the book, amusingly followed up by Alice having to forgive herself for the grammatical faux pas. That Alice accidentally created an ocean of tears while Giant then got lost in it while Tiny is in the book, and it is indeed there that she meets the dodo and a few other creatures. His later employment of a crocus race to try to drive people off is in the book, although there he took part himself and they did it away from the waves. Everyone in Wonderland was insane, not stupid. Upon her second encounter with the White Rabbit, he mistakes her for his servant, setting off a chain of events that led to her growing massive inside his villa. Alice then shrinking down and meeting a caterpillar who she frustrates by not being able to answer the simple question of who are you, because she feels she's changed too much in her time in Wonderland to be able to answer him. He recommends a mushroom to her that, in both the book and the film, is one of several things that will affect Alice's size quite drastically. The grinning Cheshire Cat and his disappearing ability are pretty accurate, although his behaviour is something I'll have to swing back to later. The game of croquet using hedgehogs, flamingos and card guards is pretty similar, although Alice doesn't get made a fool of in the process of playing it. That it was all a dream at the end is also true to the book, and I am adamant that this is the only story that can get away with this ending without it being a total bullshit cop-out. So far, I'm pretty damn impressed. Good job, Disney. Let's see if you can keep it going. The biggest issue the film has when it comes to inaccuracy isn't so much that they added in stuff of Disney's own making, it's that it borrows quite heavily from the pseudo-sequel Through the Looking Glass and what Alice found there. Examples of this include things like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the story they tell of the walrus and the carpenter, the judgmental talking flowers, and the concept of an unbirthday, none of which technically featured in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. These things would have to be classed as accurate adaptations, but of the wrong book. Tulgey Wood is another reference to Through the Looking Glass, but it's not as accurately adapted as Tulgey is just a nonsense word used in a poem to describe what the wood was like, not the name of the wood. It's probably for the best that it's not the same place, as that's where the Jabberwocky hangs out, and this version of Alice sure as fuck doesn't look like she can handle a Vorpal sword. There are also some non-Looking Glass discrepancies in the film too. Stuff like Alice dismissing any book without pictures, making her seem like a disinterested airhead. In the book, her objection was that it lacked pictures and conversations, meaning she just had an unusual criteria for liking novels. The part where she expresses a desire to visit a more interesting world where nothing follows the traditional rules is added just for the film, film. There's only a few lines in the beginning of the book describing where Alice was and that she was feeling slightly bored before boom, rabbit passing by. Not really any time to establish any deep-seated unhappiness with her current situation. The character of Alice is made intentionally more bland in the film. She was the straight woman for the rest of the world's insanity to play off. It wasn't that clear-cut in the book. Sometimes it was Alice herself who was the most interesting person in the room. Her somewhat simplistic but refreshingly alternative way of reasoning was fun to read about. The way she works through her existential crisis halfway through is amusing in a way not easy to explain, so it's another reason to read the book for yourself if you haven't already. Dinah, the much-loved cat, is mentioned by Alice a few times but doesn't feature directly in the original story. Now that I think about it, it's a bit weird that they had a cat that was capable of noticing weird shit and waving in the real world where shit's supposed to make sense. Oh wait, she was already asleep by this point. Well played, Disney. Well played. The talking doorknob isn't in the book, but it's one of those things I mentioned at the start with the film added stuff, but it feels okay because it's exactly the kind of thing that would have been in the book if the book was longer. Bill the Lizard, while in the film a little, is actually a recurring character in the book. He's one of those the butt of every joke kind of person. Every time something is thrown in anger, it will inevitably hit him and no one else, that sort of thing. Also, the reason the poor bastard went flying out of the chimney wasn't because she sneezed, she kicked him on purpose. Alice was a bit of a bitch in the book. In the film, the caterpillar had some sort of vowel fixation that wasn't in the book. He also didn't interrupt her elocution recital. The slightly warped poem that came out of her mouth unbidden contributed to her sense of unreality. He also didn't turn into a butterfly in the book, and was seemingly uninterested in the concept of doing so. The tea party with the Mad Hatter, the March Hare, and the very sleepy Dormouse is in both versions of the story, but it's portrayed in two very different ways. In the film, it's part of an unbirthday celebration, but in the book, they're not actually having the tea party by choice. The Hatter claims that time has a personality, and if you're nice to it, it will slow down for you while you're having a fun time and speed up for you when you're sad. He also thinks that he had inadvertently offended time a few months previously, so time had frozen for him at 6 PM. Days, months, and even years would still pass, but it would always be 6 o'clock all the way through them, meaning that for him, it would always be tea time. The Hatter and the Hare essentially believe themselves locked in a perpetual limbo. For them, it would always be tea time, forever, constantly moving one place setting around a massive table until such a time as time forgives them. Whether this is true or just a creation of their broken minds is not confirmed in the book. The Queen of Hearts is interesting in that she's accurate in some ways but also changed a good deal. In the film she's just a large woman, but in the book she and the king were playing cards just like all of her subjects. Her signature scream of "off with their heads" is accurate, but her death sentences were never actually carried out in the book. Either the king would quietly pardon everyone as soon as her back was turned, or Alice simply hid the condemned cards out of sight until the guards lost interest and wandered off. The Cheshire Cat was more of a mildly interested but mostly impartial observer in the book. He didn't intentionally piss off the queen, the royals just took offense to his very existence and tried to figure out a way to chop off his head, even though at the time he was only a head. Because he wasn't a dick in the original story, Alice didn't get in trouble with the queen, and therefore she wasn't the defendant in the trial that was held. That role was reserved for the knave, who was accused of eating the jam tarts the queen had just made. Said uneaten tarts were Exhibit A in the trial, a point no one thought was odd and Alice didn't bother bringing up. What's probably the most interesting change is Alice's attitude all the way through the story. In the film she's... well, the best way I can think to describe it is she's more invested in everything. In the book, the whole "it was all a dream" thing was extra believable because of the somewhat detached way Alice behaves all the way through the story. Even in our deepest, most realistic dreams, there's always a part that doesn't quite feel real and stops us from reacting to things like we would usually. Carroll really captured this well, with Alice never seeming to feel anything past mild curiosity to the insane things happening around her, even when they became life-threatening. On multiple occasions, film Alice got flabbergasted and annoyed by the madness and overwhelmed by her situation. It's an understandable but still disappointing change. While having a more invested lead is most definitely a good thing in almost every other situation, the entire point of the book was that it was essentially pointless. There's no intro, there's no climax, there's not even any sort of real ending, it's just a dream in book form. And I suspect it's this very atypical format that made the book popular in the first place. That the movie did not, in my opinion, successfully recreate this, but was still awesome, is a testament to Disney's talent at the time. I think Disney pulled through this section reasonably well as well. Let's give them one last chance to drop the ball though. Y'all are gonna love this. You know that bit of the film where the bird accuses Alice of being a serpent? Well, that makes a lot more sense in the book because on this occasion the mushroom didn't make her grow in proportion. Her neck stretched up like 100 frickin' feet. In an attempt to get her mouth back down so she could eat the other side of the mushroom, she found that she could bend it in multiple places and zigzags back downwards. I'm certain I'm not alone here when I say Another omitted part of the book is her visit to the Duchess, a rather strange section even by the book's own standards. After a confusing conversation with a logically impaired doorman sleeping outside, Alice walks into a kitchen to find the Duchess holding her baby while a cook sprays pepper everywhere, making everyone sneeze. The Duchess is casually, violently abusive towards the apparently indestructible child, while the cook occasionally throws pots and pans at her head, something she completely ignores. Feeling she has to rescue the child, Alice takes it outside with her, but it quickly turns into a pig, so she lets it wander off. Make of that what you will. There's also a bit while she's escaping the rabbit's villa where a puppy tries to play with her while she's still tiny. It makes her a tad nervous, to say the least. And finally, the film neglected the griffin and the mock turtle, two creatures that live in the Queen's garden and teach Alice some songs and how schools work under the sea. So while there isn't a lot left out, like I said at the beginning, there's not much excuse for even this considering the length of the book. The Dom's final thoughts. On the whole, I'd definitely say this is a fair to good adaptation. Some parts are recreated virtually verbatim, but there are enough subtle tonal shifts and tweaks to the characters to stop it from being truly great. It is a shame that they replaced just enough elements of the first book with parts of the second that doing a sequel was pointless. There's so much stuff from Through the Looking Glass that I would have loved to have seen Disney's take on, like the story of decapitating the Jabberwocky and the world as a giant chessboard. This is another occasion where I'm happy to recommend both versions individually, but would caution you against watching the film too soon after reading the book and vice versa, because you might find it just a little bit jarring. Thanks for joining me, beautiful watchers. I'll see you next time.
How do you get to Wonderland?